The bonding ceremony was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, it became the exact moment Catherine Vance's entire world shattered into silent, jagged pieces. The winter solstice had brought the longest night of the year, a fitting shroud for the death of her future. She stood concealed within the heavy velvet shadows of the upper gallery, looking down at the immense expanse of the grand assembly chamber of Valdris. The ancient fortress was a monument to raw, predator power, its architecture carved from winter itself. Soaring black stone pillars rose like the ribs of a leviathan, supporting of a vaulted ceiling lost in darkness. Every banner hanging from the obsidian walls bore the roaring wolf of House Valdris, interwoven tonight with the striking silver serpents of House Sterling. The visual confirmation of their union hung heavily in the air, stifling and absolute. Thousands of thick beeswax candles flickered inside enormous iron chandeliers, casting a warm, molten gold light over the gathered nobility of the kingdom. Down below, the air was suffocatingly thick. It carried the rich, heavy scents of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the overpowering, aggressive musk of hundreds of dominant wolves waiting for their sovereign to speak. Catherine's lungs pulled in the freezing draughts that slipped through the cracks of the high stained glass windows, but she did not shiver. Her entire physical and mental focus remained anchored on the man standing at the grand altar at the far end of the chamber. Arthur Valdris, the Alpha King, the most feared warrior of his generation, and her fated mate. Even from this isolating distance, the physical reality of their bond thrummed in her veins like a living, pulsing entity. It was a golden thread of ancient magic, a river of liquid silver that connected the very core of her chest to his. For the past 6 months, that secret connection had been her sanctuary. It was a silent, constant language composed of shared warmth, synchronized heartbeats, and his faint, grounding scent of wild cedar and incoming winter storms. Through that bond, she could constantly feel the heavy, crushing burden resting on his broad shoulders. She could feel the exhaustion radiating from his mind, a toxic byproduct of the relentless political warfare he had been fighting against the corrupt High Council. But tonight, the golden thread did not offer comfort. It felt strained to the point of breaking, vibrating with a discordant, sickening tension that made Catherine's stomach churn. Arthur stood rigid beneath the staggering weight of the ceremonial crown. It was forged from black iron and adorned with jagged ice diamonds, a crown that required absolute ruthlessness to wear. His storm-glass grey eyes, usually so expressive when he looked at her in private, were fixed straight ahead, locked in a dead, unblinking stare. He refused to look up at the eastern gallery. He refused to acknowledge the exact spot where he had explicitly told her to wait for him. To his right stood Eldred Sterling, the Grand Chancellor of the Council. The older man was a master manipulator, a politician whose polite smiles never reached his cold, hollow eyes. He was a man who played with lives like pawns on a chessboard, sacrificing thousands of foot soldiers just to secure this exact political checkmate. Eldred wore ceremonial robes of deep crimson silk, his chest puffed out with the unmistakable arrogance of a predator who had finally cornered his ultimate prey. He had spent years maneuvering his family into a position of absolute necessity, choking the crown's supply lines and funding rebel uprisings, just to force this very moment. And standing perfectly still beside the Chancellor was his daughter, Cynthia Sterling. Catherine's own half-sister. They shared the same bloodline but not the same status. While Cynthia had been raised in the opulent, ruthless halls of the Sterling estate, groomed for power and adorned in jewels, Catherine had been treated as the shameful secret of their father's past. Cynthia was the golden child, the recognized heiress, the weapon Eldred had forged to conquer the throne. Catherine was nothing but a shadow, a Vance by name, tolerated only because of her exceptional, innate knowledge of medicinal herbs and ancient healing. Cynthia was draped in a breathtaking gown of spun silver and white silk, the fabric glittering like a freshly sharpened blade in the candlelight. She was the pristine portrait of a high-born lady, untouched by the horrors of war and entirely insulated by her father's immense fortune. She looked every inch the perfect, aristocratic Luna that the harsh northern territories demanded. She possessed the pure blood pedigree, the massive wealth, and the political alliances necessary to prevent the impending civil war. Catherine knew all of this. She understood the brutal mechanics of royal survival better than anyone, but logically understanding the necessity of the blade did not make it hurt any less when it was deliberately driven through her heart. The high priest of the pack, an elderly wolf with scars across his throat, raised his hands. Instantly, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the massive assembly. "We are gathered under the eternal gaze of the ancient divine," the priest intoned, his deep voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceiling. "To witness the sealing of the realm. Alpha King, present the one you claim as your equal, the one whose blood shall mix with yours, the one who shall bear the title of Luna to guide and stand beside you in the coming dark." Catherine's hands trembled, her fingers curled tightly into the stone balustrade, her fingernails scraping against the rough granite in a desperate attempt to ground herself in the physical world. She waited for Arthur to stop the procession. She waited for the brilliant twist, the clever political maneuver he had promised her in the dark safety of his chambers just 2 nights ago. He had held her face, kissed her forehead, and sworn he would dismantle Eldred's faction publicly. He had sworn their soul bond was sacred, a divine mandate that no council could override. The silence stretched on, thick and unbearable. The temperature in the hidden gallery seemed to plummet below freezing, the cold seeping aggressively through the soles of Catherine's leather boots and creeping up her legs. Then Arthur moved. He did not look up, he did not hesitate, his jaw locked tightly, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He extended his right hand. It was the same hand that had traced gentle patterns on Catherine's skin, the hand that had sworn a blood oath to protect her against the entire world. Mechanically, with agonizing deliberation, he offered it to the woman standing beside him. "I, Arthur of the House of Valdris," his voice thundered through the silent chamber, a deep, resonant baritone that carried the absolute, unquestionable authority of an apex predator. "Claim Cynthia of the House of Stirling as my chosen Luna. Together, we shall bind the North." Those words struck the golden thread connecting him to Catherine like a heavy, rusted axe. Snap! Catherine gasped silently, her mouth opening in a silent scream as a hollow, violent ache exploded in the dead center of her chest. It was not a poetic metaphor. It was a severe physical trauma, a violent, magical severance of the tether that had anchored her soul to the earth. The comforting warmth that had lived inside her chest for months evaporated instantly, replaced by a glacial, numbing void that felt like falling into a frozen lake. The spectral fangs of rejection tore into her spirit. Her knees buckled under the immense, crushing gravity of the betrayal. She clamped her teeth down over her bottom lip, biting so hard that the sharp, coppery taste of blood flooded her tongue, using the physical pain to anchor her fractured consciousness. Down below, the crowd erupted into deafening, triumphant roars. The sound was a physical blow. Cynthia placed her delicate, pale hand into Arthur's larger one, a victorious, predatory smile curving her painted red lips. She had won. The golden child had claimed the ultimate prize, successfully erasing the invisible, discarded half-sister from existence. Eldred bowed his head respectfully to his new king, but his eyes gleamed with the malicious satisfaction of a flawless, bloodless coup. The northern borders were secured. The political machinery of the High Council had won out over the will of the Fates, and Catherine Vance had just become a ghost. She did not cry. The shock pulsating through her nervous system was too profound, the betrayal too absolute for something as fragile and weak as tears. She leaned her back heavily against the cold, damp stone wall of the alcove, closing her eyes as the thunderous cheers of the pack vibrated fiercely through the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight, forcing her seized lungs to draw in the freezing winter air, inhale the ice, exhale the pain. The terrifying reality of her new situation crystallized with absolute clarity in her mind. The Alpha King had made his definitive choice. He had chosen military power, political stability, and the heavy crown over the sanctity of their mate bond. But in the ruthless, paranoid world of werewolf politics, an unclaimed true mate was never just a discarded lover. She was a massive liability. She was a living, pulsing threat to the legitimacy of the new Luna and the fragile alliance holding the kingdom together. If she stayed within the walls of the capital, she would not survive the week. Eldred Sterling was too meticulous, too ruthlessly efficient to leave such a glaring vulnerability alive. There would be a quiet, tragic accident, a poisoned cup of tea brought by some sympathetic servant, a fatal slip on the treacherous icy stairs of the Western Tower. Arthur, trapped by the demands of his new political marriage and drowning in council duties, would either look the other way for the sake of peace or remain entirely blind to the assassination until her body was already cold. Catherine gradually opened her eyes. The amber fire in her irises, once warm, trusting, and full of gentle love, had hardened into something cold, sharp, and impenetrable. She could not fathom the sovereign's true, hidden reasons for this sudden betrayal. She didn't know if his mind had been chemically poisoned by Eldred's dark magic, or if his insatiable ambition for a united kingdom had simply eclipsed his soul, and she definitely lacked foresight of the catastrophic, world-burning chain of events her next actions would soon unleash upon the continent. All she knew right now was the freezing, hollow ache expanding in her chest, and the primal screaming instinct of her inner wolf demanding she survive at all costs. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. Pleading on her knees before the court would only strip her of the one valuable thing she still possessed, her unwavering dignity. She stepped to the edge of the shadows and cast one final, lingering look down at the man who was supposed to be her forever. Arthur was entirely consumed by the pageantry of the ceremony, raising a heavy golden goblet to the cheering, adoring masses. He looked powerful, he looked untouchable, he looked like a complete stranger. Without making a single sound, Catherine turned her back on the blinding light of the immense chamber and slipped deeper into the protective darkness of the stone corridors. This silent departure was not a cowardly surrender. It was the quiet, calculated preparation for her own absolute sovereignty. The winter night outside the heavily guarded walls of the citadel was brutal. It was a howling, chaotic expanse of freezing wind and dense, horizontal snow. Catherine moved through the environment with the silent, practiced grace of a phantom, actively keeping to the jagged, shadowed tree lines that bordered the royal training grounds to avoid the patrols. She wore nothing to protect her from the elements, but a dark woolen tunic, heavy leather boots, and the massive mantle draped heavily over her small shoulders. It was the ceremonial cloak of her lineage, woven from the finest midnight blue wool and intricately embroidered with thick silver thread. It was heavy, incredibly warm, and distinctly, undeniably hers, a royal garment instantly recognized by every guard, tracker, and noble in the kingdom. 3 miles west of the capital's towering iron gates, the deep, ancient pine forest gave way to the treacherous, rocky banks of the western boundary river. The deafening roar of the rapids echoed miles before the water came into view. The waterway was a violent, churning artery of dark, freezing liquid that aggressively carved its way through the northern mountains. Its currents were notoriously lethal, heavily tainted with natural raw silver deposits, bleeding from the rocks that made the water highly toxic to werewolf physiology. To fall into the western rapids was a guaranteed, agonizing death sentence. The dissolved silver instantly stripped a wolf of their natural healing abilities, while the freezing, violent whirlpools dragged them down into the lightless, crushing depths. As Catherine approached the sheer rocky overlook suspended above the worst of the rapids, the distant, chaotic sounds of violence echoed sharply through the snow-laden trees. It was the distinct, terrifying cadence of a rogue skirmish. Earlier in the evening, routine scout reports had indicated a desperate pack of feral, landless wolves attempting to breach the western perimeter defenses in search of food. Now, the clash of steel, the guttural, blood-curdling snarls of transforming warriors, and the heavy, sickening scent of copper and wet earth drifted clearly on the wind. The Royal Guard was fully occupied trying to contain the breach. The border was in absolute chaos. It was the perfect, bloody, unmonitored canvas required to paint a convincing tragedy. She finally reached the precipice of the cliff. The roar of the raging water below was deafening, the white, frothing foam crashing violently against jagged, black stones. The icy spray lashed mercilessly at her face, stinging her pale cheeks and freezing instantly on her eyelashes. She stood at the edge, looking down into the swirling, violent maw of the deadly water, the hollow empty space in her chest where her beautiful mate bond used to be pulsed with a sharp phantom pain, a cruel, echoing reminder of the warm life she was permanently leaving behind. Catherine reached up with stiff, freezing fingers and unfastened the heavy silver clasp at her throat. The massive fabric of the ceremonial cloak fell heavily into her waiting hands. She did not hesitate. Gripping the thick edges of the wool, she planted her boots on the ice and pulled with all her remaining physical strength. The heavy fabric resisted for a moment, then tore with a sharp, violent ripping sound that was immediately swallowed by the overwhelming roar of the rapids. She systematically shredded the bottom hem and the collar, creating long, jagged, violent tears that perfectly mimicked the devastating swipe of massive rogue claws. From a small, concealed leather pouch attached to her belt, she retrieved a sealed glass vial. Before fleeing the castle grounds, she had slipped into the royal hunting kennels and collected the blood of a freshly slaughtered stag meant for the hounds. It was thick, dark, and still carried the heavy, metallic tang of violent death. She unstoppered the glass vial and poured the thick crimson liquid generously over the torn, ruined edges of the garment. She dropped to her knees and ruthlessly rubbed the fabric against the sharp, icy rocks, grinding the blood deep into the woven fibers. She had to ensure it looked exactly as though a desperate, brutal, and ultimately fatal struggle had taken place right on the slippery edge of the abyss. She left deep gouges in the snow, kicking the dirt to simulate the panicked, frantic movements of a cornered Omega fighting for her life. Next, she reached deep inside her tunic and pulled out a heavy, incredibly precious antique object, the Vance family crest. It was a solid silver medallion, meticulously engraved with the ancient image of a crescent moon sheltering a weeping willow. It had been in her family for over 4 centuries, the absolute last remaining artifact of her fallen honorable house. It was her true identity, her legacy, the only proof of who she really was. Her numb fingers traced the cold, raised silver edges one last agonizing time. A single ragged gasp escaped her trembling lips, puffing white into the freezing air. Then, she knelt and jammed the thick silver chain of the crest securely between 2 sharp, blood-stained rocks. She left the beautiful medallion, dangling precariously over the edge, positioned exactly where a desperate, flailing hand might have caught it in a final attempt to survive, before slipping inevitably into the fatal toxic waters below. The grim scene was perfectly set, a violent, bloody struggle, a torn, ruined garment bearing her scent, a dropped, priceless heirloom, and the lethal, silver-laced river ready and waiting to consume the total lack of physical evidence of a body. When Arthur's elite military trackers finally found this desolate place tomorrow morning, they would read the tragic story exactly as she had written it. They would logically conclude that the rejected, heartbroken, and emotionally vulnerable Omega had wandered blindly into the dangerous forest in a state of deep psychological shock, stumbled tragically into the violent rogue skirmish, and been brutally driven over the edge to a watery, unrecoverable grave. But the illusion was not yet complete. To survive the manhunt that would follow, she needed to ensure her ongoing physical scent did not lead them away from the cliff and into the human territories. Catherine pulled a second, much smaller, heavily reinforced vial from her pouch. This one contained a dark, viscous liquid, a specialized, highly concentrated wolfsbane elixir she had secretly stolen from the deepest vaults of the royal apothecary. It was an incredibly dangerous, highly illegal substance. When consumed in trace amounts, it acted as a devastating chemical suppressor, temporarily paralyzing the biological glands that produced a werewolf's unique, identifying pheromones. It erased the scent entirely, rendering the user virtually invisible to even the most skilled Leica trackers' trackers. But the physical toll it exacted on the body was sheer, unfiltered agony. She unstoppered the small glass tube. The smell alone was acrid and toxic, burning the sensitive lining of her nostrils. Catherine tipped her head back, closed her eyes, and swallowed the bitter, foul-tasting draught in one single gulp. The biological reaction was instantaneous and entirely brutal. Pure liquid fire exploded in the back of her throat, racing down into her stomach like she had swallowed crushed glass. She dropped hard to her knees in the packed snow, coughing violently as her advanced biological systems desperately fought the invasive poison. Her veins felt as though they were suddenly being pumped full of liquid ice. Her muscles cramped so hard they felt like they were snapping off the bone, and a layer of cold, slick sweat broke out across her forehead despite the freezing ambient temperature. She clamped both hands over her mouth, biting down hard on her own palm, absolutely refusing to make a single sound that might alert the nearby rogues. She rode out the agonizing, crushing waves of nausea and pain in total silence. With excruciating effort, the intense burning subsided, leaving behind a profound, unnatural, terrifying numbness. Her inner wolf, the spiritual entity that had guided her since birth, went completely, devastatingly silent, forced into a deep chemical hibernation to survive the poison. Her distinct scent, the delicate, recognizable aroma of rain-washed orchids and sweet honey, was completely gone. She was now nothing more than a scentless, ordinary human shadow shivering in the snow. Catherine pushed herself up from the frozen, blood-stained ground. Her legs trembled violently with weakness, but she locked her knees, drawing on a hidden reservoir of quiet, unyielding willpower she didn't know she possessed. She stood on the very edge of the cliff, looking down at the blood-soaked ceremonial cloak and the dangling silver crest. The winter wind howled fiercely around her, carrying the distant, mocking cheers of the assembly chamber and the much closer, brutal sounds of the rogue war. She was no longer Catherine Vance. She was no longer the fated mate of the Alpha King. She was dead to the treacherous world of Valdris. Turning her back on the churning, toxic river and the magnificent kingdom that had so easily broken her, she pulled the hood of her plain tunic up to shield her face from the biting, relentless wind. The journey on foot to the neutral human territories, toward the distant borders of Thornwick, would take weeks. The winter would be unforgiving, harsh and brutal, but as she took her first, scentless step into the dense, lightless forest, the freezing air filling her lungs felt remarkably cleaner. She walked away into the heart of the blizzard, leaving no footprints that wouldn't be buried by morning, no scent for the wolves to follow, and absolutely no looking back. The vast, heavy silence of the ancient forest swallowed her whole. She was nobody. She was a ghost, and ghosts could not be hunted. The dawn that broke over the kingdom of Valdris was the color of a bruised corpse, a sickly, pale greyish purple that seemed to bleed across the horizon. The winter sun offered no warmth, only a pale, sickly light that reflected off the endless expanse of undisturbed snow. But the snow at the western boundary river was not undisturbed. It was heavily trampled, violently churned, and stained with vast swathes of frozen crimson. Arthur arrived like a localized hurricane of wrath and pure, unadulterated terror. Arthur did not wait for his royal guard to fully secure the perimeter. He threw himself off the back of his massive armored warhorse before the beast had even come to a complete halt, the heavy iron stirrups clashing loudly against plate armor. His heavy steel boots slammed into the icy earth, cracking the frozen mud beneath his weight. For the past 12 hours, his entire existence had been reduced to a singular blinding state of panic. He had abandoned his own wedding feast the absolute second he realized the upper eastern gallery was empty. He had not touched the new Luna. He had not spoken to the High Council. He had simply torn off the ceremonial crown, let it clatter meaningless to the stone floor, and shifted into his towering, midnight black wolf to hunt. He had let her slip away into the shadows of the gallery, like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest. He had believed his political maneuver was an absolute necessity. He had intended to secure the northern borders with a fake, unconsummated marriage, while keeping his true mate hidden and protected under heavy guard, until he could surgically dismantle the treacherous factions from the inside. It was a flawless, logical strategy on parchment, but he had completely underestimated the devastating physical reality of severing a soul bond, even temporarily. The exact moment he spoke the vows, the golden thread had snapped, and his internal beast had gone completely, irrevocably insane, howling in a pitch of agony that threatened to tear his ribs apart from the inside out. Now, standing at the edge of the roaring, toxic rapids, the freezing air stripped the breath from his lungs. The deafening sound of the churning water, laced with lethal amounts of raw dissolved silver, filled his ears with a constant, mocking roar. His elite trackers, heavily muscled lichens bred specifically for the hunt, were already fanned out across the jagged cliffside, their heads bowed low in submissive silence. None of them dared to look their sovereign in the eye. Arthur's chest heave. The familiar steely hue had not returned to his eyes. They remained a terrifying, solid amber. He took a slow, agonizing step forward. The scent of copper and violent death hung thickly in the freezing air, aggressively masking everything else. The rogue skirmish from the previous night had left a chaotic canvas of destruction. Torn pine branches, deep claw marks in the granite, and the scattered remains of feral wolves littered the tree line. But his hyper-focused vision bypassed the carnage of the rogues. His eyes locked onto a patch of violently disturbed snow at the very edge of the precipice. He walked toward it, his muscular legs moving mechanically. The ambient temperature around him seemed to plummet drastically, a localized physical manifestation of his crushing despair. He fell heavily to his knees on the hard, unforgiving ice. There, caught on a jagged outcropping of black stone, was a heavy mass of shredded, dark fabric. His large, trembling hands reached out. His leather gloves scraped against the sharp rock as he pulled the ruined material free. It was the ceremonial cloak. The incredibly dense, midnight blue wool was torn into ragged ribbons, the exquisite silver embroidery utterly destroyed by what looked like massive, frantic claw swipes. But the most horrifying detail was the blood. The fabric was deeply, irreparably soaked in a thick, stiff layer of frozen crimson. Arthur brought the ruined wool to his face, burying his nose in the icy fabric. He desperately inhaled, searching for the delicate, rain-washed orchid and sweet honey scent of his mate. But the metallic, overwhelming reek of raw blood overpowered his highly tuned senses. It smelled like pure terror. It smelled like the end of the world. A low, guttural sound tore its way up from the deepest depths of his chest. It scraped against his vocal cords like crushed glass. It was not a human cry. It was the primal, agonizing whimper of a dominant alpha who had just lost his sole reason for existing. He clutched the bloody cloak to his chest, his broad shoulders shaking violently under the oppressive weight of the winter sky. Arthur. The voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely unwelcome. Arthur did not turn around. His fingers gripped the torn wool so tightly that the skin over his knuckles stretched white, the joints popping audibly in the quiet morning air. Eldred approached the cliff edge with measured, highly cautious steps. The Grand Chancellor was wrapped in heavy sable furs, his breath puffing in small white clouds. He looked down at the kneeling Alpha, his hollow eyes completely devoid of genuine sympathy. To the older politician, this grim scene was not a tragedy. It was the final, perfect resolution to a messy logistical problem that threatened his daughter's ascension. "The trackers have scoured the area," Eldred said, his tone perfectly calibrated to convey a respectful, manufactured sorrow. The rogue pack breached the perimeter in a state of starvation. It appears she wandered into the forest alone, highly disoriented from the events of the evening. She was caught directly in the crossfire. The physical evidence points to a desperate struggle. She was driven over the edge. The older man gestured smoothly toward the roaring, toxic river below. "No wolf can survive the Western Rapids, Arthur. The dissolved silver would strip her healing instantly. It is a devastating loss. But we must logically look to the stability of the kingdom." Silence. The roar of the water seemed to fade into the background. The wind stopped howling through the pines. For 5 agonizing seconds the world held its breath. Then Arthur moved. He didn't just stand. He exploded upward with terrifying, blinding speed. Before the Chancellor could even register the violent shift in the air pressure, a massive hand closed around his throat. Arthur lifted the older man entirely off the ground, his boots dangling uselessly over the blood-stained snow. The elite trackers surrounding them instantly dropped to one knee, submitting unconditionally to the overwhelming, suffocating wave of dominant alpha aura that crushed the clearing. "Lie," Arthur snarled, his voice dropping to a demonic, vibrating growl that physically shook the frost from the surrounding trees. Eldred choked, his face rapidly turning a mottled, dark purple as his airway was completely crushed. He clawed frantically at the iron grip holding him suspended, his polite political mask shattering into pure, unfiltered panic. "Alpha," one of the trackers dared to whisper, keeping his head firmly pressed to the dirt. "We found this, wedged securely in the rocks." The tracker held up a trembling hand, his knuckles pale and slick with frozen mud. Dangling from his thick fingers was a hefty silver chain, attached to a familiar medallion, the Vance family crest. Arthur's glowing eyes darted to the antique silver piece. The crescent moon and the weeping willow gleamed coldly in the weak sunlight, the only tangible proof of her lineage, the physical confirmation that she had been exactly where the blood was spilled. He released his grip just enough to let the Chancellor draw a ragged, wheezing breath, but he did not lower the man to the ground. He leaned in incredibly close, his face mere inches from Eldred's terrified, bulging eyes. "You think I am a fool," Arthur whispered, the deadly quiet of his tone far more terrifying than any roar. "You think I do not know how my own soul functions. If she were dead, the bond root inside my chest would have turned to ash. It would be perfectly silent. It would be completely cold." He pressed his free hand roughly against the center of his own chest, right over his violently pounding heart. "But it is not cold. It is bleeding. It is screaming. The rejection." Eldred gasped out, spitting saliva onto the Alpha's armored gauntlet in his desperate struggle for air. "The snap. It severed your connection. You cannot physically feel." "I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I accept that," Arthur interrupted, his voice echoing with absolute, dictatorial finality. He threw the older man backward into the snow like a discarded broken toy. Eldred scrambled away, coughing violently and clutching his deeply bruised throat. The smug arrogance that had defined the politician for decades was entirely gone, replaced by the stark, horrifying realization that he had drastically miscalculated. He had believed that severing the mate bond would effectively domesticate the Alpha. Instead, it had unchained a monster. Arthur turned his back on the coughing Chancellor and walked to the very edge of the precipice. He stared down into the churning, toxic white water. The logical evidence was overwhelming. The blood, the cloak, the crest. Any rational mind would conclude that the Omega was gone forever, swallowed by the lethal currents. But his inner beast cared absolutely nothing for logic. It cared only for absolute possession. A traitor had orchestrated this. An enemy had manipulated the rogue attack, kidnapped his mate, and staged this elaborate, bloody theater to break his spirit and force his compliance with the High Council's new regime. He slowly turned to face his kneeling military commanders, the heavy sable cloak billowing around his massive frame like storm clouds. His once immaculate tempestuous grey irises were now perpetually ringed with deep bruised shadows, completely swallowed by a terrifying solid amber. "Recall the northern garrisons," Arthur commanded, his voice slicing through the winter air like a physical blade. "Cancel the trade treaties with the eastern provinces, shut down all borders immediately. No one enters Valdris, and absolutely no one leaves without my explicit personal authorization." Alpha, the lead tracker, spoke hesitantly, risking a quick glance upward. "The eastern provinces are our primary allies. To blockade them without provocation is an act of war." "Then let it be war," Arthur replied softly, his jaw set like carved granite. "They have taken what is mine. I do not care if she is being held in the deepest dungeon of the Shadow Realms, or if I have to tear every single brick of this continent apart with my bare hands. We march until we find her, and any pack, any territory, any city that denies me access." He paused, looking down at the frozen blood caking his leather gloves. "Will be reduced to ash." The commanders bowed their heads lower, recognizing the absolute, uncompromising truth in his words. The Alpha King was no longer a politician calculating peace. He was a grieving, obsessed predator, and he was about to set the world on fire, just to find the ghost of the woman he had pushed away. 1 year later, the metallic, suffocating reek of frozen silver and blood was entirely replaced by the thick, earthy odors of wet slate, coal smoke, burning tallow, and horse manure. The human-dominated border town of Thornwick sat nestled in a deep, fog-shrouded valley, completely insulated from the ruthless, magical politics of the northern Lycan territories. Inside the small shops, however, That mundane, grimy chill gave way to the comforting, grounding aroma of dried chamomile, crushed mint, and roasted oak bark. It was a mundane, quiet settlement characterized by cobblestone streets, heavy slate-roofed cottages, and the continuous, gentle hum of ordinary labor. There were no grand obsidian castles here. There were no howling packs, no dominance displays, and no grand assembly chambers where destinies were violently severed for political gain. It was a place where people lived simple, predictable lives, entirely unaware of the apex predators that ruled the vast continent beyond the mountains. For the woman now known strictly as Elena, the suffocating normalcy of Thornwick was the greatest luxury she had ever experienced. She stood behind the worn, polished oak counter of the town's only apothecary, systematically grinding a small pile of dried willow bark into a fine powder with a heavy stone mortar and pestle. The physical, repetitive motion was incredibly soothing. With every rotation of her wrist, the dull, rhythmic grinding sound served to drown out the lingering, phantom echoes of a cheering crowd that still occasionally haunted her nightmares. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight, pouring all of her focus into the precise, delicate work. The brutal, unforgiving journey across the frozen wilderness a year ago had nearly killed her. When she had finally collapsed at the edges of the human settlement, her boots had been worn completely through, her hands severely frostbitten, and her core body temperature dangerously low. She had looked like nothing more than a starving, destitute refugee fleeing the border skirmishes. It was Bain Rowan who had found her shivering in the icy alleyway behind his shop, her skin blue, her lips cracked, her breath coming in shallow, icy gasps. The elderly human was a permanent fixture in Thornwick. He was a man of quiet observation, possessing kind, deeply crinkled eyes, and a perpetual smell of earthy pipe tobacco and medicinal ointments. He had not asked her for a family name. He had not demanded to know why a young woman was wandering alone through a lethal blizzard with nothing but the torn clothes on her back. He had simply wrapped her in a thick woolen blanket, sat her by the blazing hearth in his back room, and placed a cup of hot, heavily sweetened tea in her trembling hands. When she had recovered enough to speak, she offered him a fabricated story about a burned village and a lost family. He accepted it with a gentle, unquestioning nod, but it was her innate, near-encyclopedic knowledge of rare botany that truly secured her place in his world. On her third day of recovery, she had quietly stopped Bain from mixing a dangerous ratio of foxglove into a heart remedy, expertly balancing the potent toxin with a neutralizing extract of sweetbriar. Recognizing a master herbalist when he saw one, the old man had immediately offered her a permanent position in his shop and the small, empty attic room above it. Not used, not owned, chosen. For the first time in her entire life, her immense knowledge was valued not as a convenient political asset for a royal house, but as a genuine, life-saving skill. She was earning her own bread, sleeping under a roof she maintained, and meticulously building an independent existence from the ashes of her old one. Over the past 12 months, Catherine had woven herself seamlessly into the fabric of Thornwick. The heavy wooden door of the apothecary chimed cheerfully as a customer entered, letting in a swirl of damp, cold street air. Catherine did not flinch. She simply looked up, offering a polite, practiced smile, her amber eyes soft and entirely devoid of the sharp, predatory gleam typical of her species. She had completely mastered the art of being invisible. She was the quiet, helpful assistant. She was Elena. After the customer departed with a wrapped bundle of feverfew, the shop fell back into a comfortable, dusty silence. Bain emerged from the back storehouse, carrying a heavy crate of empty glass vials. He set them down on the counter with a soft grunt, wiping his calloused hands on his stained canvas apron. "You have a remarkable touch with the willow bark, Elena," Bain murmured, his eyes lingering on the perfectly ground powder she was carefully funneling into a ceramic storage jar. Most apprentices crush it too forcefully, destroying the essential oils you treat the plants with. Reverence. "They offer us their strength," she replied softly, her voice carrying a quiet, melodic cadence. "The least we can do is handle them with profound respect." The old man smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached the corners of his eyes. "Go on up and rest. The evening rush is over, and the snow is starting to fall heavily again. I can manage the inventory." She nodded politely, wiping her hands on a clean linen cloth. "Thank you, Bane. Good night." She locked the iron cash box, extinguished the oil lamps in the front windows, and quietly made her way to the narrow, creaking wooden staircase at the back of the shop. As she climbed the steps, the ambient temperature dropped slightly, but it was a natural, mundane cold, completely unlike the supernatural, bone-chilling frost of the monarch's throne room. She reached the heavy wooden door of her attic room and unlocked it. Stepping inside, she let out a long, slow exhale. This was her nesting room. It was tiny, cramped, and the ceiling sloped sharply on one side. But to her, it was an absolute palace. She had spent the past year meticulously transforming the bare space into an impenetrable sanctuary. Thick, heavy quilts were layered over the smorgasbord in the corner. Bunches of dried lavender, sage, and cedar hung from the exposed wooden rafters, filling the enclosed space with a rich, complex aroma that aggressively overpowered any outside scents. She had caulked every tiny crack in the window frame and laid thick, woven rugs over the floorboards to muffle her footsteps. It was a space designed entirely around safety, warmth, and absolute physical boundaries. No one entered this room without her explicit consent. Not an alpha, not a chancellor, not a ghost. She walked over to the small iron stove in the corner, throwing in 2 small logs and stirring the glowing embers until a cheerful, crackling fire sprang to life. The heat radiated outward rapidly, slowly warming the deep chill from her bones. She sank into a padded armchair near the fire, pulling a thick, knitted shawl tightly around her shoulders. For a few minutes, she simply allowed herself to exist in the profound silence, but the silence was not entirely empty. Deep within the core of her chest, buried beneath dense layers of trauma, physical exhaustion, and chemical suppression, the hollow ache of the severed mate bond still throbbed with a dull, persistent rhythm. It was exactly like a phantom limb. The golden thread was gone, violently cut by the declaration of a new Luna, but the psychological scar tissue remained. Some nights, she woke up gasping, her body instinctively reaching across the empty mattress for the crushing, protective weight of a man who belonged to someone else. Some wounds could only be healed with love, but right now she had to accept isolation. She could not afford the luxury of grief. Survival required absolute, uncompromising discipline. Catherine stood up and walked over to a small, heavily reinforced wooden chest tucked safely beneath her bed. She pulled a small brass key from a chain hidden under her tunic, unlocked the heavy padlock, and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was the small glass vial she had carried from the capital, the Wolfsbane elixir. The dark, viscous liquid sloshed ominously against the curved glass. The original dose she had taken at the cliffs a year ago had been a massive, system-shocking amount designed to instantly paralyze her inner wolf and erase her scent trail for the initial escape. But to maintain her anonymity in the human world, to ensure that not a single trace of her lichen pheromones ever leaked into the atmosphere, she had to consume a highly calculated micro-dose every single night. It was a delicate, terrifying chemical tightrope. If she miscalculated and took a single drop too much, the potent poison would permanently stop her heart. If she took a fraction too little, the suppression would fail, and her unique, sweet scent would eventually drift on the wind, acting as an undeniable beacon for the relentless, highly trained trackers she knew Arthur had unleashed. She carried the vial to her small wooden desk, placing it next to a specialized tiny glass dropper. The glass was cold, practically biting into her skin. Her hands, usually so steady when grinding herbs for Bane's customers, trembled slightly as she unscrewed the metal cap. The acrid, toxic smell hit the air, instantly burning her sensitive nasal passages. Her suppressed inner wolf, a silent, trapped entity buried deep in the ice of her subconscious, whimpered weakly in primal terror. The beast hated the poison. It hated being caged, blinded, and gagged by the dark magic of the elixir. "I know," she whispered into the empty room, her voice barely a breath. She pressed her hand firmly against her own chest, offering a small, comforting friction to the trapped spirit within. "I know it hurts, but we cannot let them find us. We cannot go back to being a shadow in his court." With absolute, practiced precision, she squeezed exactly 3 drops of the dark liquid into a small ceramic cup of tepid water. The clear water instantly clouded over, swirling into a bruised, sickly purple color before settling into a murky, unappetizing gray. She didn't hesitate, because hesitation bred fear, and fear inevitably bred fatal mistakes. She raised the cup to her lips and swallowed the mixture in one quick, fluid motion. The reaction was not as violent as the first time, but it was still incredibly agonizing. A localized wave of pure, freezing pain bloomed in the dead center of her stomach, rapidly spreading outward through her nervous system like sharp spider webs of ice. She dropped her forehead against the cool wood of the desk, gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles popped. A cold sweat broke out immediately across the back of her neck. Her muscles seized, violently cramping as her advanced lichen biology fought the invasive toxin, desperately trying to heal the damage it was simultaneously causing. She squeezed her eyes shut, riding out the silent, crushing waves of nausea. She did not cry out. She simply breathed through it, utilizing the intense physical pain as a grounded anchor to keep her mind focused on the present reality. Slowly, agonizingly, the severe cramps began to subside. The burning ice in her veins settled into a dull, manageable ache. Her body relaxed, slumping heavily against the desk. It had worked. The suppression was successfully reinforced for another 24 hours. Her scent was completely neutralized, entirely replaced by the mundane, slightly bitter smell of the apothecary herbs that clung to her clothes. She was safe. Catherine slowly pushed herself up, wiping the cold sweat from her brow with a trembling hand. She carefully sealed the vial and locked it back inside the wooden chest, sliding it deep under the bed where no prying eyes could ever find it. She walked back to the armchair and curled her legs beneath her, staring blankly into the flickering orange flames of the small stove. The physical toll of the elixir was exhausting, but it provided a profound psychological relief. Suddenly, a sharp phantom spike of searing heat flared in her chest, accompanied by the undeniable smell of burning ash and melted silver. Catherine gasped, pressing her hand over her heart until the violently hot sensation faded. Completely unaware of the inferno her mate was currently unleashing across the continent. The scent of ash and burnt silver did not just follow the Alpha King. It clung to his soul like a second skin. His temporary command tent was erected on the scorched, blackened soil of what used to be a prosperous eastern trading post. The reinforced canvas walls flapped violently against the biting winter wind, the thick fabric snapping with the sharp cadence of a cracked whip. Inside, the atmosphere was a furnace. 4 heavy iron braziers filled to the brim with glowing red coals heated the space, turning the air into a physical weight. The interior hung thick with the smell of burning pine and melting iron. Yet the sovereign standing at the center of the room radiated an aura of glacial zero. He was a localized epicenter of freezing dread, pulling all the warmth from the room and crushing it under the immense gravity of his grief. He had not removed his plate armor in 5 agonizing days. The dark, interlocking steel plates were marred with deep, jagged scratches and crusted with dried brown blood. No one in his royal guard dared approach him to clean it. His signature steely gaze was completely gone, entirely consumed by the glowing, unnatural molten gold of a feral beast that refused to yield control back to the human mind. The wolf was at the surface, prowling just beneath the Alpha King's scarred skin. It was starving, desperate for the familiar scent that had been violently ripped away. The physical hollow in his chest, the exact anatomical location where his luminous mate bond had been severed a year ago, throbbed with a relentless rhythm. It did not feel like an empty space. It felt like a jagged, bleeding crater of dark magic, constantly filled with crushed glass. He pressed his heavy, steel-clad gauntlet against his breastplate. He felt the frantic thud of his own heart against his ribs. A heart that no longer beat to govern a kingdom. It beat exclusively for revenge, a singular bloody purpose that drove him to the edge of sanity. The heavy flap of the command tent was pushed aside, letting in a chaotic swirl of freezing rain and the metallic stench of wet mud. 2 muscled royal guards marched into the heat, dragging a broken, stumbling figure between them. Eldred Sterling was no longer the arrogant, perfectly groomed politician who had orchestrated the royal betrayal. Stripped of his luxurious sable furs and golden chains of office, The prisoner wore nothing but coarse, filthy prison wool hanging loosely off his emaciated frame. His pale wrists were bound in heavy, rusted iron chains that clanked against the wooden floorboards. The older man's throat was permanently scarred, wrapped in thick, mottled purple scar tissue from Arthur's crushing grip a year ago. The politician who once commanded the High Council was now nothing more than a broken shell of a man, shivering violently as the heat of the braziers hit his freezing skin. The guards forced the captive down to his bony knees. The sound of joints hitting hard wood echoed in the tense silence of the tent. Arthur did not speak, he did not yell, nor did he posture. He stood towering over the kneeling politician, a silent monument of predatory wrath. He slowly reached into the small leather pouch secured at his weapons belt and pulled out a tarnished, dented object. The silver medallion, the Vance family crest. He rubbed his calloused thumb over the delicate weeping willow engraving, a repetitive, obsessive motion that had worn the ancient metal smooth over the past 12 months of relentless marching. "We intercepted another courier from the Shadow Realms this morning," Arthur rasped. His voice was a deep, vibrating growl that shook the heavy wooden tent poles and caused the coals in the braziers to flare. The intercepted missives confirm that the southern rogue factions have been receiving unregulated shipments of high-grade military weapons. Weapons bearing the distinct Sterling family forge marks. Eldred wheezed. His damaged vocal cord struggled desperately to draw enough oxygen to produce a coherent sound. "My king! I have been rotting in your iron chains for a year. I have no control over the black market smugglers." "You have control over the truth," Arthur snarled. He stepped forward with deliberate steps until the blood-stained tips of his steel boots touched the trembling man's knees. "You funded the rogue attack at the western border to create a distraction. You hired a mercenary shadow walker to chemically mask her scent. You arranged for my mate to be smuggled across the provincial border while I was distracted by Cynthia at the altar." "Alpha, please," Eldred begged. A wet, rattling cough tore through his hollow chest, spitting a fleck of blood onto the wooden floorboards. "I swear to you on the eternal divine. I wanted the Omega gone, yes. Her lineage was a political liability, but I did not arrange to kidnap her. She wandered into the crossfire on her own, the river. The toxic rapids took her. The blood on the ceremonial cloak was lethal. She is dead." The final word hung in the stifling, smoky air, a dangerous spark in a sealed room filled with black powder, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The glowing amber fire in Arthur's eyes flared bright, casting long shadows against the canvas walls. His massive hand shot out with predatory speed, grabbing the thick iron collar secured around the prisoner's neck and hauling the emaciated man upward until their faces were inches apart. "I will dismantle this entire realm brick by brick before I accept that lie," Arthur whispered. The deadly quiet of his tone was far more terrifying than any roar. "My soul still bleeds. I can feel the phantom pulse of her terror. She is breathing. She is hiding in the dark, terrified of the political monsters you unleashed upon her. And every day you refuse to tell me which faction holds her, I will take another piece of this continent apart with my bare hands." He threw the captive backward. Eldred crumpled into a coughing heap on the floorboards, gasping for the hot, smoky air while clutching his ruined throat. Arthur turned his broad back on the display of weakness, his boots carrying him toward a massive topographical map spread across a wide wooden table. The thick parchment was littered with meticulously carved wooden wolf figurines representing various pack strongholds. Many of the wooden markers in the eastern sector were already knocked over, crushed, or burned black. He pointed a gauntleted finger at a large, fortified settlement situated near the critical Eastern Mountain Pass. The Alpha of the Eastern Border Pack refused to allow my elite vanguard to inspect his underground scent vaults this morning, Arthur stated coldly, addressing the 3 shadow-draped military generals waiting in rigid apprehension at the perimeter of the tent. "He claims sovereign immunity under the ancient blood treaties. My lord," the lead general spoke hesitantly, stepping forward out of the shadows with his head bowed in deep submission. "The Eastern Border Packs are neutral. They have traded peacefully with the Crown for over 4 centuries. If we breach their secure vaults without concrete proof of treason, The entire Eastern Coalition will declare open rebellion against the throne. Let them rebel, the king commanded without hesitation, his voice slicing through the heavy air like a blade through silk. They are hiding something in the dark. They are protecting the thieves who orchestrated the theft of my Luna. He reached over to the nearest blazing brazier, picking up a glowing iron poker by its leather-wrapped handle. Without breaking eye contact with his general, he pressed the red-hot iron tip directly into the center of the map, right over the meticulously drawn Eastern Territory. The dry parchment caught fire, curling inward and turning to black, crumbling ash as thick, acrid smoke filled the command tent. "March the vanguard at dawn," Arthur ordered, his amber gaze locked on the burning paper, like a man seeing water after wandering a desert. If they refuse to open their iron gates, break them down with the siege rams. If they refuse to speak her name, cut out their tongues. Leave nothing behind but ash and a warning to the next territory. The generals swallowed hard, the primal terror evident in the rigid, trembling set of their broad shoulders. They bowed in unison, quickly backing out of the tent to execute the catastrophic orders. The Alpha King was unhinged, a feral beast that would tear apart the known world just to reclaim the phantom haunting his every waking breath. The siege of the eastern stronghold began before the sun even crested the horizon. The sky was bleeding purple and bruised grey when the first ironclad siege ram struck the ancient timber gates. The sound was deafening, a catastrophic boom that echoed through the mountain passes and shook the snow from the pine trees. Arthur stood at the vanguard, his molten gold eyes tracking every movement on the battlements. He did not order a strategic surrounding. He did not ask for parley. He simply unleashed the full, devastating might of the Royal Northern Garrison upon a people who had stood as allies for generations. The air filled with the scent of burning pitch, shattered wood, and the coppery tang of spilled blood. The wolf within him howled, a soundless scream of agony that demanded retribution for the mate who had been torn from his soul. Every falling tower, every shattered shield echoed the unending guilt crushing his soul. The map burned. The world burned. 300 miles away, the slate-grey sky over Thornwick cracked with thunder. A freezing, relentless downpour began to batter the ancient cobblestone streets of the neutral border town. The heavy sheets of rain lashed against the thick, leaded glass windows of the small apothecary, blurring the outside world into a smudged, watery painting of deep greys and muddy browns. Inside the shop, however, the atmosphere was different. It was a carefully constructed haven of sensory warmth, meticulous order, and quiet survival. Catherine, known here as Elena, stood securely behind the worn, polished oak counter. Her slender fingers worked with a practiced, mechanical rhythm as she sorted a fresh, damp delivery of burdock roots. She wore a simple, faded linen dress covered by a heavy, stained canvas apron, her striking silver-white hair tied back in a severe knot at the nape of her neck. The air inside the small shop was thick and warm, fueled by the crackling stone hearth in the back room where a heavy iron kettle of purified water was kept at a rolling boil. Bundles of dried sage, lavender, and crushed mint hung from the exposed wooden rafters, their potent fragrances masking any lingering trace of the wild lichen scent she worked so desperately to suppress. The rhythmic drumming of the freezing rain against the slate roof was hypnotic. It served as a steady, grounding white noise that helped keep her suppressed inner wolf locked safely beneath the freezing chemical ice of the daily wolfsbane elixir. She reached for a small paring knife and began peeling the tough, fibrous outer skin of a stubborn root, letting the earthy scent of the wet soil fill her lungs. She paused, setting the knife down to flex her stiff fingers. A year had passed since she had left the bloody ceremonial cloak by the toxic rapids. A year of waking up in a cold sweat, her chest tight with the phantom ache of the severed mate bond. A year of forcing herself to build a life out of the ashes of her humiliation. Bane Rowan had been a salvation she never expected, offering her a quiet corner of the world where questions were scarce and hard work was respected. She had made herself indispensable, using her deep knowledge of herbalism to heal the sick and mend the broken. It was a simple, exhausting life, but it was safe. It was hers. The heavy brass bell suspended above the front door did not offer its usual cheerful chime. It frantically clattered against the thick glass. The wooden door was shoved open with desperate, uncoordinated force, letting in a howling gust of freezing wind and a thick sheet of driving rain that instantly soaked the front floorboards. The sudden rush of winter air was a physical blow. It raised sharp, prickling goosebumps along Catherine's bare forearms and sent a shiver racing down her spine. She dropped the paring knife, the blade clattering against the wooden counter, and looked up. Her normally calm eyes widened at the chaotic scene spilling into her quiet sanctuary. It was not a local customer seeking a simple willow bark headache powder or a minor sleep aid. It was a tragic tangle of shivering, bleeding, traumatized humanity. 5 people stumbled heavily over the wooden threshold, leaning desperately on one another to stay upright. Their clothes were soaked through, torn to ragged shreds, and stained with patches of dark, crusting blood and thick layers of greasy black soot. Bain Rowan emerged from the back storehouse. His wooden pipe dropped straight from his mouth, shattering into pieces on the wooden floorboards as he took in the sheer carnage. By the merciful divine, Bain breathed, rushing forward on his bad knee to help a collapsing, soot-stained woman who was fiercely clutching a wailing toddler to her chest. Elena, lock the door behind them to keep the freezing draft out. Bring the boiling water, the linen bandages, and the yarrow extract. Now, Catherine didn't hesitate. She abandoned her sorting station, her leather boots thudding across the floor as she shoved the heavy oak door shut against the raging storm. She threw the thick iron deadbolt securely into place with a loud, metallic clack. She pivoted sharply on her heel, her disciplined mind instantly switching into the cold, hyper-focused state of a battlefield medic. Within seconds, the quiet apothecary transformed into a frantic triage center. The refugees were guided toward the warmth of the back hearth, collapsing heavily onto the thick woven rugs in pitiful piles of shivering, exhausted agony. Catherine knelt beside a traumatized man whose entire left arm was horrifically burned. The flesh was bubbling, blistered, and raw from intense heat exposure. The sickly sweet, metallic smell of infected burns and severe frostbite permeated the enclosed room, overpowering the comforting aroma of dried chamomile and roasted oak bark. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind noted the severity of the wounds. These were not the casual injuries of a tavern brawl or a hunting accident. These were the devastating signatures of organized warfare. "Hold still," she murmured. Her voice was steady and professionally soothing as she dipped a clean cloth into a ceramic basin of warm, sterilized water. "This is going to sting, but I have to clear the ash and debris from the open wound before the infection spreads to your bloodstream." The young man hissed, a sharp intake of breath through clenched teeth as she swabbed the ruined, blackened skin. He was trembling so hard his jaw jumped, his teeth audibly chattering in the warm room. We didn't think they would do it," the injured man gasped, his eyes blown wide and dilated with shock. "We surrendered our weapons immediately. The village elder opened the iron gates to let the vanguard in, but the royal soldiers, they didn't care about our surrender. They just started throwing the torches into the thatched roofs." Bain paused in binding another refugee's sprained ankle, his wrinkled brow furrowing in confusion. "Who exactly did this to your village, son? Are the violent southern rogue factions raiding the mountain passes again this early in the season?" The refugee let out a hollow, broken laugh that morphed into a wet, rattling cough, shaking his burned frame. "Rogue packs? No, a rogue wolf just wants to steal your winter gold and leave you in the snow to starve. This was an organized military army, a massive tide of heavy black armor and howling, colossal beasts that tore the gates off their hinges." Catherine's hands froze over the ceramic basin. A single heavy drop of bloody, ash-stained water fell from her tightly clutched cloth. It hit the calm surface of the bowl with a sickeningly loud plop. The blazing room suddenly felt as though it had plunged into a deep freeze. "The Black Wolf," the terrified mother rocking the toddler whispered from the corner, her voice trembling with primal terror. "The King of Ash. He marched his elite royal northern garrison directly into the peaceful eastern provinces. They are systematically tearing the continent apart." Catherine felt the warm air violently vanish from her seized lungs. Her heart slammed violently against her ribs, striking the bone so hard it cracked the breath from her throat. A wave of nausea crashed through her. The edges of her vision darkened, the sounds of the crying toddler and the crackling fire fading into a dull, echoing roar. "The Alpha King?" Bane asked, his gentle tone laced with sheer disbelief. Why in the world would the Northern Crown attack its own established Eastern allies? The territorial trade treaties have held for centuries. There is no strategic logic. Because the Sovereign has gone irrevocably mad, the burned man rasped. His uninjured fingers weakly clutched at the rough linen sleeve of Catherine's dress for grounding. He didn't take Cynthia at the altar. They say a rival faction stole his true fated mate right out of the gallery during the bonding ceremony. The Luna was taken, and now the king is punishing the world until she is returned to his side. The walls of the apothecary began to spin. Catherine stared blankly at the ruined, bloody cloth clutched in her trembling hands. Her vision blurred as a crushing wave of realization crashed down upon her shoulders, threatening to pin her to the floor. The physical weight of the truth was suffocating. He didn't take Cynthia. He hadn't officially married her sister. He had never politically replaced her. The political theatre she had painfully witnessed from the velvet shadows of the gallery, the devastating rejection that had physically shattered her soul bond and sent her fleeing into the blizzard, it had all been a temporary lie, or an interrupted maneuver, or a catastrophic miscalculation. She had stood there, watching him look right through her, believing herself cast aside, discarded like broken glass. She had accepted her humiliation in absolute silence, refusing to beg, refusing to cry out for a mate who had chosen ambition over their sacred bond. And because she had refused to stay and be a silent victim, because she had staged her own violent death at the toxic river, leaving the Vance family crest and ceremonial cloak behind to escape a perceived assassination by Eldred's counsel, she had unwittingly unchained an apocalypse upon innocent people. She had thought her death would bring peace. She had believed Arthur would simply move on, ruling his kingdom alongside Cynthia, while she faded into obscurity. Instead, the Alpha King truly believed she had been stolen from him. He believed she was suffering in some dark, freezing dungeon, waiting for him to save her, and in his blinding, feral grief, he was burning the world to the ground to find a ghost that did not exist. His madness was a direct consequence of her survival. The blood of these innocent refugees was on her hands. Where? Catherine forced the single word past her numb lips, her voice barely a hollow whisper. She had to swallow heavily, her throat clicking audibly just to lubricate her paralyzed vocal cords. Where exactly is this army now? The refugee squeezed his eyes shut. A hot tear of pure exhaustion leaked down his soot-stained cheek, leaving a clean, pale trail through the grime. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. They broke the impenetrable eastern stronghold 3 days ago, he breathed. The words fell like heavy executioner's blades in the quiet of the healing room. They crossed the neutral mountains early this morning. They are marching straight west. They are coming directly for Thornwick. The ceramic basin slipped from her numb fingers, clattering sharply against the stone hearth. The warm, bloodied water spilled across the uneven floorboards, creeping slowly toward the toes of her heavy leather boots. She stared downward at the spreading red puddle. The undeniable truth settled deep into her frozen bones like poured lead. Her carefully constructed sanctuary was gone. The quiet, invisible life she had bled so heavily and endured so much poison to build was about to be trampled under the steel boots of the man who would rather burn the world to ash than ever let her freeze alone. The freezing, churned mud of the royal encampment offered absolutely no mercy to the broken men chained to its surface. The torrential winter rain that had been battering the continent for 3 consecutive days had turned the staging grounds into a desolate, freezing swamp of black sludge and animal waste. Eldred Sterling, the formerly untouchable Grand Chancellor of the High Council, knelt shivering in the deepest part of that filth. His emaciated wrists were secured tightly to the heavy, rusted iron spokes of a massive siege wagon. The coarse, rain-soaked prison wool clung to his bony frame like a shroud of ice, drawing every ounce of residual heat from his failing body. His throat, permanently disfigured and wrapped in layers of rigid, Mottled purple scar tissue from Arthur's crushing grip a year ago throbbed with a dull, unrelenting agony every time he tried to swallow the freezing rain. He was a man who had once dictated the economic and military fate of the entire Northern Hemisphere from a velvet-lined chair. Now he was reduced to a starving animal, dragged behind the sovereign's apocalyptic military campaign as a living punching bag, forced to witness the systematic destruction of the world he had tried to conquer. The disgraced politician lowered his head, trying to shield his face from the biting wind when the heavy, rhythmic thud of armored cavalry approached. A specialized squad of elite royal trackers, their dark cloaks heavy with water and their silver armor scored with fresh battle damage, rode into the center of the camp. They had just returned from raiding the neutral merchant roads near the border territories. Eldred cracked open his swollen eyes, watching with detached, cynical exhaustion as the trackers dismounted and began unloading their confiscated spoils. The Alpha King had ordered a complete, suffocating embargo on all surrounding provinces. Any caravan, regardless of its origin or diplomatic immunity, was being violently intercepted and stripped of its cargo in Arthur's insane, blind search for his missing mate. The soldiers began throwing heavy wooden crates and tightly bound canvas sacks directly into the mud for the quartermaster to inventory. The violent handling of the goods was careless, driven by the sheer exhaustion of a localized war that had no logical end. One of the massive pine crates, weakened by the relentless rain, slipped from a soldier's gauntleted hands. It hit the iron rim of a wagon wheel and shattered open with a sharp cracking sound. Dozens of small, meticulously packed bundles spilled out into the freezing mud. Delicate glass vials wrapped in raw cotton, bundled stalks of dried sweetbriar, and heavily sealed ceramic jars cracked upon impact. But it was the distinct, overwhelming odor that hit the damp air that made the captive's blood run completely cold. It was a sharp, acrid, highly toxic scent that aggressively burned the sensitive lining of the nasal passages, cutting straight through the overwhelming reek of wet horse hair and iron. Eldred slowly lifted his head, his hollow eyes locking onto the spilled contents. Scattered across the black sludge were several dozen thick, dark roots and perfectly preserved. Bruised purple flowers, pure, unrefined wolfsbane. The quartermaster, a heavily scarred lichen with a missing eye, immediately stepped back, covering his nose and mouth with his heavy leather gauntlet in primal disgust. "Burn that crate immediately," the officer snarled, kicking a shattered vial away with his steel-tipped boot. "It's lethal. Why in the name of the divine would a neutral merchant caravan be transporting this volume of concentrated poison? The manifest claims it was sourced from the deep southern swamps, sir," the lead tracker replied, wiping the freezing rain from his visor. It was heavily guarded, bound for a small, neutral human settlement on the western border. A trading post called Thornwick. The shipping manifest was explicitly destined for Bane Rowan's apothecary, establishing a direct paper trail. The merchants claimed it was commissioned by a local human healer for treating severe cardiac ailments in livestock. "Humans are fools," the quartermaster spat, waving his hand to signal the cleanup crew. "Gather it up with the iron tongs and throw it in the incinerator trenches before the fumes sicken the war beasts." The soldiers moved to obey, completely ignorant of the monumental, world-altering significance of what they were sweeping into the fire. But Eldred Sterling was not ignorant. His brilliant, highly calculating political mind, which had been paralyzed by a year of torture and freezing mud, suddenly sprang back to life with terrifying clarity. He stared at the crushed purple flowers being swallowed by the mud, the intricate, disparate puzzle pieces of the last 12 months rapidly locking into place inside his head. Wolfsbane was an absolute, undisputed death sentence for any werewolf. No rogue faction, no matter how desperate or heavily armed, would ever willingly transport or refine the root, because even inhaling the raw dust could cause irreversible neurological damage and fatal cardiac arrest. To a lichen, it was the equivalent of carrying radioactive waste. There was only one highly specific, deeply illegal use for concentrated wolfsbane in the magical underworld. When synthesized with sweetbriar and subjected to a complex, agonizing refinement process, It created a chemical elixir capable of completely paralyzing a werewolf's biological pheromone glands. It was the only known substance on the continent that could entirely erase a lichen's unique identifying scent, rendering them virtually invisible to even the most elite trackers. But the physical agony required to consume such a poison daily was unimaginable. The toxicity would kill an average wolf within a week. It required a master herbalist, someone with an encyclopedic, innate understanding of botanical neutralizing agents, to balance the microdoses perfectly. Someone like the illegitimate, quiet half-sister he had so easily discarded. Eldred's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound escaping his ruined throat. The Vance family lineage was renowned for their deep, ancient knowledge of medicinal magic. Catherine Vance had grown up entirely isolated in the castle's apothecary, her hands always stained with crushed leaves and rare roots. The realization hit the fallen chancellor with the force of a physical blow. The absolute lack of a body at the Western Rapids, the perfectly staged, bloody cloak, the deliberately abandoned family crest, his desperate, feral insistence that his soul bond was still faintly, agonizingly pulsing in the dark. She wasn't dead. The Omega hadn't wandered blindly into a rogue skirmish, and she certainly hadn't been kidnapped by a rival political faction. She had meticulously faked her own brutal assassination to escape the royal court, and she was currently hiding in a miserable human border town called Thornwick, using massive quantities of royal-grade poison to mask her biological existence. A name unspoken for a year grows teeth, and the disgraced politician was finally ready to let it bite. Eldred let out a low, raspy chuckle. The sound was broken, wet with blood and freezing rain, but it was laced with the unmistakable, arrogant triumph of a man who had just found the key to his own salvation. He was completely unaware that the royal vanguard had already destroyed the eastern strongholds. He had no inkling the sovereign was entirely prepared to massacre innocent humans without a second thought. And he definitely failed to realize that the very secret he was about to leverage would ultimately seal his own execution. All the older man knew was that the absolute power dynamics of the kingdom had just shifted back into his chained, trembling hands. "Guard," Eldred croaked, his voice a pathetic, grating whisper, barely audible over the howling wind. He weakly rattled the heavy iron chains, binding his wrists to the wagon wheel, dragging the metal against the wood to create a sharp, grinding noise. A massive, armored sentry standing near the quartermaster's tent turned his helmeted head, his eyes narrowing in disgust at the miserable prisoner. He marched over, his hand resting heavily on the hilt of his broadsword. "Silence, traitor!" The guard growled, raising a steel-clad boot to kick the kneeling man back into the mud. "Speak again, and I will remove your tongue. Take me." "To the king," Eldred wheezed, shrinking back from the impending blow but keeping his hollow. Desperate eyes locked on the soldier's visor. "I know who is buying the poison. I know exactly where the ghost is hiding." The sentry froze, his heavy boot hovering inches from the captive's ribs. The entire royal army knew the absolute, suicidal danger of offering the feral Alpha King false hope. But they also knew the penalty for withholding potential evidence regarding the missing Luna was immediate public execution. The guard slowly lowered his foot, his expression grim. He grabbed the thick iron collar around Eldred's neck and hauled the shivering, broken politician to his feet. 2 hours later, the devastating consequences of that whispered revelation materialized on the western horizon. The rhythmic, deafening vibration of 10,000 steel-clad boots marching in perfect, lethal unison shook the very bedrock of the neutral border valley. The storm over Thornwick had not abated. If anything, the freezing downpour had intensified, turning the cobblestone streets into running rivers of icy grey water. But the rain could not mask the sheer, apocalyptic terror that was currently descending upon the quiet human settlement. The Royal Northern Garrison did not approach with the respectful diplomacy usually afforded to neutral territories. They arrived like a localized natural disaster. Heavy, armored siege engines rolled down the muddy mountain passes, their iron-banded wheels crushing the simple wooden boundary fences into splinters. Ranks of elite Lycan infantry, heavily armed and radiating a suffocating, aggressive dominance, fanned out in a massive, impenetrable perimeter, completely sealing off every possible escape route from the valley. At the absolute vanguard of the invading force rode the Alpha King. Arthur Valdris sat atop a monstrous, heavily armored black warhorse, his massive frame perfectly still despite the chaotic, freezing storm raging around him. His dark plate armor, still scored with the jagged, bloody marks of the Eastern Siege, seemed to absorb the weak grey light of the afternoon. The Sovereign did not wear a crown. He wore the terrifying, silent aura of an apex predator that had finally cornered its elusive prey. The dead space behind his ribs, where the golden thread had been violently severed, now radiated a freezing, absolute zero. His signature steely gaze was completely gone, entirely consumed by the glowing, unnatural molten gold of his surfaced inner beast. The wolf was fully in control, its singular, obsessive focus locked onto the small, slate-roofed buildings huddled in the center of the valley. The town square of Thornwick was utterly silent, save for the heavy, drumming sound of the rain against the cobblestones. The human villagers had barricaded themselves inside their homes, peering through the cracks of their wooden shutters with wide, terrified eyes. They were simple tradesmen, farmers, and artisans. They possessed absolutely no magical defenses and no military training. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the werewolf army surrounding their homes was paralyzing. Arthur pulled hard on the heavy leather reins, bringing his massive warhorse to a halt directly in the center of the main square. The beast snorted violently, a thick plume of white steam erupting from its flared nostrils into the freezing air. The Alpha King did not shout. He did not issue a booming, theatrical ultimatum to the hidden villagers. He simply raised his heavy, steel-clad right hand. Instantly, a specialized division of royal archers stepped forward from the front lines. They simultaneously drew back their heavy composite bows. The arrows they nocked were not standard military issue. They were thick, iron-shafted projectiles wrapped in heavily saturated pitch cloth. With a synchronized, terrifyingly disciplined movement, the archers struck flint against steel, igniting the arrows. The magical alchemical fire roared to life, burning violently despite the relentless, freezing downpour. Hundreds of flaming arrows were now pointed directly at the highly flammable, dried thatch and wooden roofs of the human settlement. The threat was absolute. There would be no negotiation. There would be no political treaties honored today. The heavy oak door of the town's only apothecary slowly creaked open. Bane Rowan stepped out into the freezing storm. The elderly human moved with a pronounced, painful limp, his bad knee stiff-locking in the bitter cold. He wore no armor, no weapons, and carried no banner of truce. He was dressed only in his stained canvas work apron and a thin woolen sweater, entirely exposed to the elements and the lethal glowing arrows aimed at his home. The old man walked to the center of the cobblestone square, stopping 10 paces away from the towering armored warhorse. He kept his head up, his crinkled eyes squinting against the driving rain, and offered the terrifying sovereign a slow, deeply respectful bow. He did not beg, and he did not cower. He displayed the quiet, unyielding dignity of a man who had spent his entire life healing others, and had long ago made peace with his own mortality. "My king," Bane spoke, his voice surprisingly steady, carrying a calm, grounding cadence that defied the chaotic violence surrounding him. "Thornwick is a recognized sanctuary of neutrality. We hold no weapons of war. We harbor no rogue factions. Why do you bring the fire of the North to our quiet door?" Arthur stared down at the fragile human. The golden, molten fire in his irises did not flicker. He slowly reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a crumpled, rain-soaked piece of parchment. He tossed it casually into the mud at the old man's feet. "That is a confiscated shipping manifest from the southern swamps," the sovereign's voice rumbled. It was a deep, vibrating growl that physically shook the puddles on the cobblestones. It sounded like grinding tectonic plates, devoid of any human empathy. It details the purchase of a massive, highly illegal quantity of raw wolfsbane, a poison that serves absolutely no purpose to humanity, other than the systematic execution of my kind. Bane glanced down at the ruined paper, the freezing rain quickly washing the black ink away. He kept his hands clasped firmly in front of his apron to hide their slight, involuntary tremor. "Wolfsbane is a highly versatile botanical, Your Majesty," the apothecary owner replied smoothly, desperately trying to maintain the fragile illusion of normalcy. In heavily diluted, purified trace amounts, it is used to treat severe joint inflammation and cardiac spasms in our draft horses. It is a standard, albeit dangerous, veterinary compound. Lie. The single word thundered through the empty square like a physical blow. The absolute certainty in the king's tone left no room for debate. Arthur swung his massive, armoured leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. The heavy impact of his steel boots, cracking against the wet cobblestones, sounded like a death knell. He took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward the elderly human. The sheer overwhelming pressure of his dominant alpha aura rolled off his broad shoulders in suffocating, invisible waves, forcing several of the hidden villagers inside their homes to physically collapse to their knees in primal terror. My trackers have intercepted the smugglers. My interrogators have broken the merchants, Arthur stated, his voice dropping to a deadly, intimate whisper as he towered over the apothecary. I know the exact refinement process required to synthesize that specific volume of poison into a biological suppressant. I know that only a master herbalist, trained in the high courts, could possibly survive the daily dosage required to mask a royal lichen scent. Bane Rowan's throat worked as he swallowed hard, the icy rain plastering his thin grey hair to his skull. He refused to break eye contact, fiercely protecting the quiet, deeply traumatized woman who had become like a daughter to him over the past 12 months. There are no royal lichens here, Alpha, Bane said quietly, his voice carrying the solemn weight of a man speaking his final words. We are simply healers. If you wish to burn my shop for purchasing veterinary supplies, then burn it. But spare the innocent families huddled in these homes. The golden fire in Arthur's eyes flared dangerously. The beast within him, starving, frantic, and completely unhinged by a year of violent, agonizing grief, surged against the fragile constraints of his sanity. He did not care about the human's bravery. He did not care about innocent lives. He looked at the quiet town like a man standing at the edge of his own grave, entirely willing to pull the rest of the world down into the dirt with him. I am not here for your shop, human, the sovereign snarled softly, his steel gauntlet slowly rising to signal the waiting archers. I am here for the ghost hiding inside it. Bring her out to me now, or I will turn this entire valley into a monument of ash. Inside the dimly lit, perfectly sanitized confines of the apothecary, Catherine Vance stood paralyzed in the shadows. She was pressed flat against the cold stone wall beside the front window, her breathing completely arrested. The thick, heavy scent of dried lavender and crushed mint that usually offered her such profound psychological comfort now felt like a suffocating burial shroud. Through the narrow crack in the heavy wooden shutters, she had a clear, terrifying view of the cobblestone square. The physical reaction to her proximity to her fated mate was immediate and devastating, completely overriding the toxic, freezing chemical ice of the wolfsbane elixir currently pumping through her veins. The suppressed, caged inner wolf buried deep in her subconscious violently clawed at the walls of its chemical prison, howling in a chaotic, agonizing mixture of primal terror and desperate, undeniable longing. Her core body temperature spiked erratically. A heavy, slick layer of cold sweat broke out across her forehead, matting her striking silver-white hair to her pale skin. Her hands, usually so steady when grinding the most delicate of herbs, shook so violently she had to press them flat against the rough stone wall just to remain upright. The phantom ache in the center of her chest, the jagged, empty crater where the golden thread of their bond used to anchor her soul, throbbed with a sickening, blinding intensity that nearly brought her to her knees. He was here. The Alpha King had actually done it. He had burned a bloody, catastrophic path across the continent, torn down the neutral eastern strongholds, and marched an apocalyptic army to her quiet, insignificant doorstep. She stared through the wooden slats at the towering, armored figure of the man who was supposed to be her forever. The pristine, calculating monarch she had watched betray her from the velvet shadows of the Grand Assembly Chamber was entirely gone. The whispered rumors from the bleeding, traumatized Eastern refugees she had treated only hours ago finally locked into place, shattering her longest-held assumption. They had spoken of a mad king who had choked the Grand Chancellor, abandoned the royal procession, and torn his own kingdom apart. Arthur had never completed the bonding ceremony. He had rejected the political alliance the very moment he discovered her bloody ceremonial cloak at the rapids. He had never married Cynthia. He had spent the last 12 months destroying everything Eldred Sterling had built. He had hunting a ghost through the ice and fire. The man standing in the freezing rain, threatening to murder a defenseless old healer, was a feral, broken monster. His armor was scarred. His posture was rigid with unyielding, obsessive violence. His signature steely gaze was completely gone, entirely consumed by the terrifying molten gold fire of madness. He could never comprehend the full extent of the agony she had endured to survive the poison. He remained ignorant of the absolute, crushing isolation of the nesting room she had built just to feel safe in the dark, and he definitely failed to grasp that the fragile, quiet Omega he had discarded at the altar had forged herself into something entirely unbreakable. Catherine watched as Arthur's heavy steel gauntlet rose higher into the freezing air. The royal archers pulled their bowstrings back to their absolute limits, the magical fire of the pitch arrows hissing violently against the torrential rain. The order to fire was mere seconds away. Bane Rowan simply closed his eyes, bowing his head in quiet acceptance of the flames, absolutely refusing to turn around and point toward the shop. A sharp physical pain tore through Catherine's chest, entirely separate from the trauma of the severed mate bond. It was the crushing, unbearable weight of true responsibility. She had accepted her humiliation in absolute silence, refusing to beg, refusing to cry out for a mate who had chosen ambition over their sacred connection. She had chosen to fake her death to protect dignity and her life. But true worth could not be suppressed hiding, and true sovereignty could not be built on the ashes of innocent people. She would not allow Bane Rowan to burn for her pride. She would rather burn with him than freeze alone in the shadows. Catherine forced her seized lungs to draw in a massive, ragged breath of the herb-scented air. She pushed herself away from the cold stone wall, her spine snapping perfectly straight. The terrified, trembling Omega, who had fled into the blizzard a year ago, was dead. The woman who walked toward the front of the shop was a queen without a crown, armed only with the cold, unyielding power of her own absolute dignity. Her leather boots moved with deliberate, heavy purpose across the wooden floorboards. She reached the heavy oak door of the apothecary, her hand wrapping firmly around the cold iron deadbolt. She did not hesitate. With a sharp, echoing metallic crack that sounded unnaturally loud over the roaring storm, Catherine threw the heavy iron bolt back and pulled the door wide open, stepping out from the shadows and directly into the freezing, relentless rain. The heavy oak door of the apothecary did not simply open. It severed the chaotic, freezing violence of the storm like a physical blade. The sharp, echoing metallic crack of the iron deadbolt being thrown back was entirely mundane, yet it rang across the cobblestone square with the devastating clarity of a tolling execution bell. For a fraction of a second, the torrential winter downpour seemed to suspend in mid-air. The suffocating, apocalyptic tension that had gripped the neutral border valley of Thornwick instantly fractured. The specialized division of Royal Archers, their muscles trembling under the immense draw weight of their composite bows, instinctively held their breath. The magical, alchemical fire of the pitch arrows hissed violently against the driving rain, sending thick, acrid plumes of black smoke spiraling into the bruised grey sky. Catherine stepped over the worn wooden threshold and out into the merciless elements. She wore absolutely no armor, no royal crests, and no protective furs. She was dressed only in a faded practical linen gown and the heavily stained canvas work apron of a common herbalist. The freezing rain immediately plastered the coarse fabric to her small frame, soaking through to her skin in a matter of seconds. The biting wind whipped her striking silver-white hair wildly around her pale face, tearing loose the severe knot she had meticulously tied that morning. Yet, as she walked past the trembling, awe-struck form of Bane Rowan to stand directly in the center of the muddy square, she did not shiver. She kept her spine perfectly straight. Her chin was lifted at an exact, unyielding angle of absolute defiance. She was no longer the quiet, traumatized Omega hiding in the shadows of a healing room, nor was she the discarded, heartbroken girl weeping silently in a velvet-draped gallery. She was a sovereign forged in the crushing, agonizing pressure of her own survival. Arthur sat paralyzed atop his monstrous, armored black warhorse. The sovereign's massive chest ceased to rise and fall. His hyper-tuned predatory senses were violently warring with his cognitive reality. The intense, highly toxic chemical ice of the Wolfsbane elixir, still pumping vigorously through Catherine's veins, was performing its lethal job flawlessly. She projected absolutely no biological scent. To the feral, starving beast prowling just beneath the Alpha King's scarred skin, the woman standing in the freezing mud was nothing more than an invisible, scentless human phantom. But his eyes saw her. Through the blur of the relentless storm, the sovereign locked onto the glowing, unmistakable amber fire of her irises. He saw the delicate, proud curve of her jawline. He saw the exact, haunting face that had been relentlessly torturing his every waking nightmare for 12 agonizing months. The massive, horrifying cognitive dissonance between the absolute silence of his nose and the undeniable proof of his vision caused a catastrophic, system-wide failure within his biology. The terrifying, unnatural molten gold fire that had entirely consumed his eyes for a year violently shattered. It fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces, rapidly receding back into the deeply bruised, exhausted storm-glass grey of the man buried beneath the monster. The heavy, black iron broadsword, gripped tightly in his right gauntlet, simply slipped from his numb fingers. The legendary weapon, which had recently cleaved through the impenetrable gates of the eastern strongholds, plummeted toward the earth. It struck the wet cobblestones with a heavy, ungraceful, metallic clang that echoed sharply off the slate roofs of the surrounding human cottages. The sound broke the paralyzing spell over the royal northern garrison. A collective, profound shockwave of realization rippled through the elite ranks of the heavily armored Lycan infantry. Helmets shifted. Massive, battle-hardened warriors involuntarily took a step back, their boots sloshing in the freezing mud, as they recognized the impossible ghost standing before their king. Arthur did not gracefully dismount. He fell. The untouchable monarch, the apex predator who had brought an entire continent to its knees, simply lost the physical ability to support his own weight. His heavy plate armor crashed into the freezing, filthy sludge of rainwater and horse manure with a sickening, heavy thud. He landed hard on his knees, the icy mud splashing up to stain the royal crest carved into his breastplate. A stunned gasp rippled through the elite ranks behind him. Thousands of battle-hardened soldiers froze in profound shock, watching their fearsome, world-burning monarch physically crumble in the mud before a simple herbalist. He did not attempt to stand back up. He did not care about the thousands of elite soldiers watching his complete, utter degradation. He crawled, dragging the massive, suffocating weight of his battle-damaged steel through the filth. The fallen monarch dragged himself across the final few yards, separating them. His broad shoulders shook with a violent, uncontrollable tremor that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing ambient temperature. He reached the tips of her worn leather boots and stopped. He slowly raised his head, his piercing silver-grey gaze wide, desperate, and overflowing with a chaotic mixture of pure terror and profound, agonizing relief. The rain washed the soot and dried blood from his scarred face, mixing seamlessly with hot, silent tears tracking down his rugged cheeks. "You," the sovereign rasped. The single syllable was completely devoid of authority. It was a shattered, wet, ugly sound that scraped against his vocal cords like crushed glass. It was the desperate whimper of a man who had wandered a lightless desert for a century, and had suddenly stumbled upon a pure, flowing spring. Catherine looked down at the kneeling giant. The physical proximity to her fated mate was a devastating assault on her suppressed nervous system. The jagged, empty crater in the dead center of her chest, where the golden thread of their bond used to anchor her soul, throbbed with a blinding, sickening intensity. Her trapped inner wolf threw itself violently against the icy walls of its chemical prison, howling for her to drop to her knees and bury her freezing hands in his wet, dark hair. She anchored herself strictly to the physical reality of the biting wind. She clamped her teeth down hard on the inside of her cheek, utilizing the sharp sting of her own blood to override the biological demand for submission. She did not reach out. She did not offer comfort. "Order your archers to lower their bows," the silver-haired woman stated. Her voice was not a scream. It was a cold, perfectly modulated directive that carried the chilling, absolute authority of a glacier grinding down a mountain. Arthur did not even look back at his apocalyptic army. He simply raised his trembling, mud-stained gauntlet and executed a weak, dismissive flick of his wrist. The absolute, terrifying power he wielded over the continent was instantly discarded as completely irrelevant in the face of her existence. The elite captains barked sharp orders down the line. The heavy bowstrings were simultaneously relaxed. The flaming pitch arrows were systematically driven point-first into the flooded cobblestones. The hissing, sputtering sound of dying magical fire filled the square, instantly replacing the threat of immolation with a thick, choking blanket of dark smoke that rolled heavily over the mud. Chained to the rusted iron spokes of the heavy siege wagon, at the rear of the staging grounds, Eldred Sterling witnessed the entire display. The disgraced Chancellor, shivering violently in his soaked prison wool, felt the last remaining sliver of his arrogant, calculating mind permanently snap. The massive, brilliant political leverage he thought he possessed, the secret of the Wolfsbane, and the hidden identity of the ghost was completely worthless. He had intended to use the information to negotiate his own salvation. Instead, the secret had voluntarily stepped out into the light, completely bypassing his manipulation and rendering him utterly, pathetically obsolete. The politician finally understood that he was going to die in the mud, entirely forgotten by the world he had tried to conquer. "I search the dark," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling as he looked up into her cold, impenetrable amber eyes. He slowly lifted his heavy armored hands, his fingers hovering mere inches from the wet, stained hem of her canvas apron. He was terrified that if he made physical contact, she would simply dissolve into mist and rain. "I tore the mountains apart. The trackers. They told me the toxic rapids took you. I smelled your blood on the frozen rocks. I found the crest." "You smelled a carefully constructed prop," Catherine replied, her tone devoid of the desperate, forgiving warmth he so violently craved. "A shredded ceremonial cloak. A discarded piece of silver. You saw exactly what your political ambitions required you to see. The tragic, convenient end of an uncomfortable problem. No." The denial tore from his chest as a visceral, agonizing roar. The king violently shook his head, sending droplets of freezing rain flying from his dark hair. "I never spoke the final vow at the altar. The moment you vanished from the upper gallery, the ancient thread snapped because your heart believed I had betrayed you. But I dropped the ceremonial crown. I abandoned the assembly. I never claimed Cynthia. I have spent every single hour of the last year burning this entire world just to find the ashes of your bones." The revelation hung heavily in the frigid air between them. A year ago, hearing those exact words might have been enough to soothe the crushing, humiliating agony of her departure. It might have been enough to make the trembling Omega fall into his arms and weep with profound relief. But Catherine Vance was dead. The woman standing in the rain had spent 12 months swallowing raw poison just to survive the political machinery he had built. "And look at the magnificent, bloody monument you have built for your grief," she stated quietly, her words slicing through his desperate excuses like a scalpel through infected tissue. She slowly raised her bare, freezing arm and pointed past his kneeling form. She directed his attention toward the impenetrable, terrifying perimeter of armored lichens, and then toward the simple, wooden shutters of the surrounding cottages where terrified human families were huddled in the dark. Finally, she gestured toward the open door of the apothecary, where the soot-stained, severely burned refugees from the eastern provinces were lying on the floorboards, crying out in untreated agony. "You did not burn the eastern provinces for me, Alpha," the herbalist continued, her voice echoing with absolute, devastating clarity over the sound of the storm. "You burned our oldest allies because you could not bear the deafening silence of your own guilt. You dragged a broken, ruined old man through the filth behind your wagons because you needed a scapegoat for your own blindness. You threatened to set fire to a sanctuary, to murder an elderly healer who gave me a warm cup of tea when I was freezing to death, all to satisfy the feral demands of your own ego. Arthur flinched violently, as if she had taken the black iron broadsword from the mud and driven it directly through his ribs. The absolute, undeniable truth of her accusation stripped away the very last, protective layers of his madness. He was not a romantic savior hunting for his lost love. He was a tyrant who had utilized his heartbreak as a convenient excuse to slaughter innocent people. He looked down at his own trembling hands. The heavy steel gauntlets were permanently stained with the dried, crusted blood of the people he had massacred during his blind, obsessive search. A hollow, suffocating wave of self-loathing crashed over his broad shoulders, pinning him to the earth. "Let me take you home," the fallen monarch begged, completely abandoning whatever tiny fraction of royal pride he had left. He pressed his forehead against the icy mud, his tears mixing with the filth at her feet. "Let me heal this devastation. I will rebuild the East with my own hands. I will execute the council. I will build you an impenetrable fortress of glass and light. Just let me claim you. Please, let me feel your warmth again." He desperately expected the familiar, comforting surge of the mate bond to answer his plea. He waited for the primal, biological instinct of reconciliation to override her anger. Instead, Catherine took a single, deliberate, highly calculated step backward. The physical distance between them increased by a mere 6 inches, but the psychological chasm that opened up was vast, freezing, and entirely uncrossable. The rejection was a tangible, heavy force in the air, a definitive boundary drawn in the mud that no amount of royal power could erase. "I am not a possession to be claimed," the silver-haired woman answered, the cadence of her voice ringing with a cold, untouchable sovereignty that instantly demanded the absolute respect of every elite soldier watching. "I am not a fragile prize you can win back with spilled blood and public groveling. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome a year ago when I stood in the shadows of the gallery, and your begging will absolutely not change the reality of today." Arthur lifted his head, his grey eyes reflecting the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man watching his last lifeline slowly slip from his grasp. He remained perfectly still, not daring to advance across the invisible line she had just drawn. "I will return to the capital," Catherine declared, her words falling like heavy stones into a still pond. "Not because I forgive your blindness, and certainly not because I wish to be your Luna. I will return because this mindless, catastrophic war must end immediately before you successfully destroy the entire hemisphere. But my return comes with absolute, non-negotiable terms." She stared down at the most powerful entity in the known world, dictating the new laws of their existence with the calm, methodical precision of a master herbalist, measuring a lethal dose. "I will not return to the suffocating shadows of the Western Tower. I will not be the silent, ornamental mate who stands 2 steps behind the throne," she ordered, the freezing rain continuing to batter her slight frame. "I will be granted a completely separate, independent estate within the city. I will take a permanent, authoritative seat on the High Council to personally oversee the economic and structural reconstruction of the eastern territories you ravaged. You will not mask your profound political failures behind my presence, and you will never, under any circumstances, attempt to force the completion of our biological bond without my explicit, freely given consent." The terms hung in the bitter wind. They represented a brutal, agonizing life sentence of perpetual emotional starvation for the Alpha King. To be entirely near his fated mate, to breathe the same air in the council chambers, to watch her interact with the court, but to be absolutely forbidden from touching her, from holding her, from ever truly possessing the soul that belonged to him. It was a daily, psychological torture far more severe than any physical execution, but as Arthur looked up into her unyielding amber eyes, he realized the terrifying alternative. If he refused her terms, if he attempted to assert his dominance, or tell his army to seize her, she would simply turn her back, walk into the apothecary, and find a new permanent way to disappear into the dark. And next time, she would not leave a trail of blood for him to follow. "Aya Kepst," the sovereign breathed. The words were a quiet, absolute surrender that surrendered his entire kingdom into her small, freezing hands. "I am your servant. Rule the North, and I will obey. I will accept 1,000 years of endless winter if it means you are simply breathing on the same earth as me." To seal the unconditional surrender, the king slowly reached down to his weapons belt. He did not retrieve his massive broadsword. Instead, he unlatched a small, ceremonial silver dagger. Without a single moment of hesitation, he pressed the incredibly sharp blade against the palm of his own left hand and pulled horizontally. The deep, clean cut immediately welled with thick, dark royal blood. He lowered his bleeding hand to the wet cobblestones, pressing his open palm firmly against the mud, directly at the tips of her worn leather boots. It was the most ancient sacred gesture of absolute fealty known to their kind. The Alpha King was publicly, legally, and magically binding his own life and authority to the will of the woman he had once deemed too politically weak to stand beside him. The red blood mixed with the grey rainwater, swirling around her feet and sealing the treaty in the sight of the eternal divine. Catherine looked down at the bowed, bleeding monarch. She did not reach out to heal his wounded hand. She simply offered a short, definitive nod, acknowledging the transfer of absolute power. The storm over Thornwick finally began to break, the heavy, bruised clouds slowly parting to reveal the pale silver light of the afternoon sun, reflecting off the puddles of the square. 6 months later, the suffocating, oppressive architecture of the royal citadel had fundamentally changed. The heavy, endless winter that usually gripped the capital of Valdris seemed to have finally softened. Catherine sat behind a massive, intricately carved desk made of polished dark oak, located within the grand sunlit study of her private sovereign estate. The room was a massive, highly elevated version of the safe, enclosed nesting sanctuary she had built in the attic of the apothecary. The high stone walls were lined with towering shelves containing ancient medical texts, detailed architectural plans for the rebuilding of the eastern trade routes, and thousands of carefully catalogued glass jars holding rare botanical specimens. The air was consistently warm, thoroughly saturated with the comforting, grounding scents of dried cedar, crushed mint, and sweet honey. She wore a simple, elegant gown of deep midnight blue silk, completely devoid of the heavy, ostentatious jewels the court normally demanded of its royalty. Her silver-white hair cascaded freely over her shoulders, catching the warm sunlight streaming through the massive stained-glass windows. A soft, respectful knock echoed from the heavy wooden double doors at the far end of the study. "Enter," Catherine called out, her voice calm and steady, not looking up from the complex trade manifest she was currently annotating with a sharp quill. The heavy doors swung inward on silent iron hinges. Arthur Valdris stepped into the room. He wore immaculate, formal dark velvet rather than his scarred plate armor, his striking metallic gaze clear and entirely free of the feral madness that had once consumed him. He walked forward but stopped exactly 3 paces away from her desk, maintaining the strict, non-negotiable physical boundaries she had carved into stone on the day of his surrender. The dynamic of the entire Northern Hemisphere had fundamentally shifted within these walls. The High Council, completely purged of Eldred Sterling's corrupt influence, now feared the quiet, measured voice of the independent herbalist far more than they ever feared the roaring wrath of the king. Cynthia Sterling had been formally stripped of her royal aspirations and permanently banished to the desolate northern outposts, her family's hoarded wealth redistributed to the eastern refugees. Catherine dictated the flow of resources. She negotiated the peace treaties with the traumatized eastern Pax, and she ensured that the royal army was used strictly for protection rather than conquest. Arthur stood quietly, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. The jagged, empty space in his chest still ached with a dull, persistent longing every single time he looked at her, a constant, physical reminder of the catastrophic cost of his past political ambitions. He was allowed to seek her counsel. He was allowed to protect her estate. But he was not allowed to cross the invisible line. Some wounds could only be healed with love, but others required vast amounts of time, unwavering distance, and the establishment of absolute, unbreakable respect. Catherine carefully set her quill down on the parchment. She looked up at the towering, powerful man who was willing to starve himself emotionally for the rest of eternity just to ensure her absolute safety. The cold, impenetrable amber fire in her eyes had very slowly begun to thaw, replaced by a quiet, calculating observation. She did not offer him a smile, but she did not dismiss him back into the cold corridors of the castle either. She simply gestured toward the empty leather chair situated on the opposite side of her desk, silently granting him the profound privilege of sitting in her presence. Arthur bowed his head deeply, a profound expression of quiet gratitude washing over his rugged features, and took the seat. The slow, meticulous process of rebuilding a ruined world and a shattered soul continued in the warm, herb-scented silence. She had stepped aside once, standing in the velvet shadows of the gallery, and believing herself entirely unworthy of the crown. She would never step aside again. Thank you for listening to this story. If their journey of quiet endurance and absolute retribution touched your heart, let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? Did the Alpha King grovel enough for your satisfaction, or does he deserve a few more years in the cold? Subscribe to join our pack for more immersive audio dramas of unyielding boundaries, hidden strength, and absolute unconditional devotion.